Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video for History by Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Barrie Wilson. He returns to the channel to discuss the topic, the Lost Gospel. He co-authored this book with Simcha Jacobovici, and I'll leave a link to the book in the description below. So welcome back to History Valley, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Look forward to talking to you and to your viewers. The Lost Gospel, was a book that was written on an ancient manuscript, one that is housed in the British Library in London. And it's a substantial manuscript. It's 29 chapters in length. That makes it twice the size of the Gospel of Mark. So it's not just a little snippet. It's not just, a small fragment. It is a document that contains a lot of material. Our publisher in New York, Pegasus Books, was absolutely amazing, and with their help, we launched the book in the British Library in London. We invited the world's press. American media covered it. Late night talk hosts joked about it. European media covered it. So it created quite a storm when it first came out. My co-author, Simcha Jacobovici, is a noted investigative journalist and also filmmaker, and he's noted in particular for doing episodes of The Naked Archaeologist. What we contend about this ancient manuscript is that it gives us the story of a human, Jewish, married Jesus. So 3 key adjectives: human and Jewish, and yes, married. So we pose the question in the book, was Jesus really married? And if so, to whom? And what is the significance of that marriage?
Yes, so was Jesus married?
Well, there are a number of hints in the Christian scriptures that he may have been married. There is certainly Paul's argument in favor of celibacy. In one of his letters, Paul says, single people and widows should remain as he is. That is, they should remain single. But he doesn't go further. He doesn't go on to say, after all, the founder of our movement, Jesus, is also unmarried. He doesn't say that at all. He just talks about himself and his own state. So you would expect him, if he were really a follower of Jesus, and that is contentious, that he would have added that Jesus was unmarried, were in fact true that Jesus was unmarried. So he doesn't do that. It doesn't clinch his argument. And so there's no mention here of Jesus being unmarried in a context where you would expect him to have said to have been unmarried, were it true. And there's also an indication that, the 2 people who go to prepare his body for burial, an act which requires undressing the individual, washing the body, placing a shroud over it, is first of all Mary the Magdalene, and secondly Mary, his mother. So these are 2 very close family relatives, however one describes the relationship between Mary the Magdalene and Jesus. But these are just hints. They're arguments from silence. And arguments from silence, as you know, are weak arguments. There is no statement in the Christian scriptures that says that Jesus was married. You know what? There's no sentence in the New Testament either that says Jesus was not married. And so that too is an argument from silence. It's equally weak. So when we look at the question, was Jesus married? I think we start from a position of neutrality. There's a weak argument for Jesus being married, equally weak argument for him being celibate.
Where would you lean towards? Would you lean towards he was married or unmarried?
If I could, let me take you on an amazing journey of discovery. This represents 5 years of research on the part of Simcha and myself as we plumbed this ancient manuscript, sleuthed out its meaning, and I think that once we see the way in which we proceeded and what this manuscript says, that we can understand that the evidence is in favor of Jesus being married. And it's interesting how we began. It began over dinner in Ephesus, Turkey. Simcha and I had been in Eastern Turkey. We'd been filming an episode for The Naked Archaeologist. We had come to Ephesus where we were going to do more filming and relaxing over a dinner and a couple of beers, as I recall. And we started talking about ancient writings that people find mysterious, writings that they haven't been able to make sense out of. And one of these writings was Joseph and Asenath. Both Simcha and I were familiar with the general contours of that ancient writing. It seems to be about the ancient Israelite patriarch Joseph, who lived some 35 centuries ago, and about his Egyptian wife Asenath. It's a story that's told in the Bible in many chapters in the book of Genesis. And we were familiar, of course, with the biblical story of Joseph. It's a story really about the meanness of his brothers and how Joseph rose to fame in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, and how he overcame all of the misfortunes of his youth. It's a familiar story. It was made into a Broadway musical. Begins with Joseph's father giving him, of all the kids, a coat of many colors. Naturally, this arouses jealousy on the part of his brothers. They try to kill him. They send him into slavery. He rises to power in Egypt. Eventually, there's reconciliation with his brothers and eventually his father. And the story makes the point that he saves the people of Egypt from famine and likewise his own family from starvation. So we knew in that discussion that Joseph is a kind of a savior figure. That's interesting. But not much is said in the Bible about Asenath, his Egyptian wife, except that he married her and had kids. And so we began to wonder, why is somebody writing a story called Joseph and Asenath? Why and Asenath? What's it got to do about her? And so we were intrigued by that, and we decided that our next step would be to go and find the oldest surviving copy of that particular work. And that's where we began. And we found it, that the oldest surviving copy of Joseph and Asenath is written in Syriac. Syriac is a language that was widely spoken by Christians in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and also the Persian Empire. Christians in the West, in Egypt and Rome and Greece and so on, spoke Greek. But if you were further east, in what is today Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, they would all have spoken and used Syriac. It's a language very similar to Hebrew and Aramaic, the language that Jesus and the disciples were familiar with, just uses a different script. So we found the oldest copy of this writing. It's part of an anthology. In the British Library, there's a manuscript called number 17202, a very famous manuscript now, because it's an anthology of some important writings, and Joseph and Asenath is just one of these writings. The manuscript itself dates from the 6th century, but that's not when all of these documents were written. They are presumably much older. So the situation we have with this manuscript from the 6th century is very similar to what we have with all of the Gospels in the New Testament. The oldest substantial portions of the Gospels that we find in the New Testament are from the 4th century. We don't think they were written then. They were written centuries before. How much earlier is open to some debate. But similarly, we thought that Joseph and Asenath, in this anthology of the 6th century, probably was an earlier writing. So that was step number one. We found a manuscript. So the next question was, well, what do we know about this manuscript? How reliable is it? Where did it come from? Who's been poking around the British Library looking for obscure Syriac manuscripts? Not many Syriac scholars left in the world. I was more familiar with Syriac in my younger days, but there are Syriac scholars, and there's some in Toronto. But so we visited the British Library, Simcha and I, on a number of occasions, and we looked at this manuscript, some 1,500 years old. And when we came to the chapter on Joseph and Asneth, there were a number of smudges and there were some indistinct areas. So what we immediately decided to do was to get a digital restoration of the manuscript. We employed a firm out of Virginia. They sent a team of digital restoration experts to the British Library. And there they took each page of this manuscript and they went through 13 different layers of the ink to try and get to the original writing underneath. And once they had done that, then we had a digitally restored manuscript as close to the original writing from the 6th century as possible. And we used that as the basis for our translation. Nobody had translated this work from the original or the oldest existing manuscript, the Syriac one. There have been a couple of translations from much later Greek manuscripts, but we wanted to go back to the earliest source that we could. And so we had a Syriac specialist translate it. And it turns out we know a lot about the manuscript. The British Library keeps very good records. British Library got it in turn from the British Museum. British Museum got it in 1847, and they list the name of the trader who brought the manuscript. Prior to 1847, it had been in a Syriac monastery in Egypt, where it had been for 900 years. Prior to that, in the 10th century, it had been acquired by the abbot there from an eastern source, just where Turkey curves down into Syria today, a few miles north of Aleppo. And so we know the history of this manuscript, where it came from and how it evolved. And quite frankly, that's more information than we know about most manuscripts. It's a very good provenance. Look at art history and the provenance of paintings. A lot of them have been interrupted over the centuries, but here, a 1,500-year-old document, we could trace back to its composition, its compilation. It's an anthology that was made in the 6th century. And that was rather interesting. But as it turns out, we know a lot more about the manuscript. But what does it say? What's the story of Joseph and Asneth? And so once our translator had made the translation and gave it to us, and he used the basis for his translation, that digitally restored manuscript, we began to read through the 29 chapters. And I think that so that we know what we're talking about, I thought I would give a brief summary of those 29 chapters, just so that everybody understands what this document is saying and how extensive it is. It's a writing about how two people, Joseph, Asneth, how they meet. It describes their courtship, their engagement, and their marriage. And as we read through this literal story, a number of things leapt out to us, and it might to the viewers of this podcast. It begins immediately with Joseph having become the second most important person in Egypt. Doesn't do any of the backstory that we find in the book of Genesis. He turns out he's making the rounds of Egypt, seeing how agriculture is developing and so on, and he comes to a town where he meets Potiphar. Potiphar is a priest. And as it turns out, Potiphar has a very beautiful daughter named Asneth. She is described in great detail. She's 18 years old. She's a virgin. No male has ever been in her bedroom. And on her estate, on her father's estate, she lives in a tall tower. That's interesting, because the tower and the penthouse that she has in this tower is described in some detail. It seems to be an important feature of the story. And Joseph decides that he would like to dine with Potiphar and his family. And in the course of doing that, Joseph and Asenath meet. Well, Joseph is described as, in the document as it says, the Son of God. He's dressed in a white linen robe. He wears a jeweled crown, and coming from his head are 12 rays of light. He is really spectacular, like the shining sun, the text says. Asenath, for her part, dresses magnificently, and as she appears to Joseph, she's described as the bride of God. Joseph is again said to be the Son of God. So just notice in passing that nothing like this exists in the book of Genesis. Son of God, bride of God, all of this kind of adornment and so on. Those details are not found in the book of Genesis. So they court. Joseph is really smitten with Asenath. He's concerned, however, that Asenath isn't Jewish. And the text here is very graphic. It says that Joseph places his hand between her two breasts, and he blesses her, and he asks God to recreate Asenath, to give her eternal life. Let her drink from the eternal cup of salvation. Let her eat the bread of eternal life. Let her be anointed with the oil of incorruptibility. That's an interesting prayer. Asenath is somewhat taken aback, and she goes back to her room, and for 7 days she begins to dispose of all of the idols of Egyptian religion. For 7 days, she implores the God of Joseph to forgive her for her idolatry, for worshiping these false idols. And so she purges herself, in a sense, of her old life. The text then says, on the 8th day, the morning star rises. Asenath has appeared to us as a transformed human being. Then she has an amazing experience. All of a sudden, a heavenly man appears in her bedchamber. No man had ever been there before. How did he get there? What was the access? What was he doing there? And this heavenly man looks like Joseph. And he tells her to put on new clothes. And putting on new clothes is symbolic of new life, becoming a new person. And the heavenly Joseph then says that God has heard Asenath's confession, and her name is now written in the book of life. He says that you will be renewed, restored, revivified. Then what does he do? Well, he sets up a table in her room. Don't know where that came from. And he also takes some honeycomb that mysteriously appears. Again, don't know where that comes from. But he says it's honeycomb from the Garden of Eden. He says that this is the honeycomb of life, and that those who eat of it will live forever. And he takes a piece of this honeycomb and he breaks it and places a piece in Asenath's mouth. As he does so, he says, you have eaten the bread of life, you have drunk from the cup of immortality, you have been anointed with the ointment of incorruptibility. Then the heavenly man, the heavenly Joseph, makes the sign of the cross in blood across the piece of honeycomb. The scene then returns from the penthouse down to some common area. They become engaged, they embrace. At their marriage ceremony, Pharaoh blesses the couple, saying that Joseph is the firstborn son of God, and Asenath is clearly the daughter of God Most High. So Joseph is no ordinary human being, and Asenath is likewise no ordinary human being. There's a huge wedding feast. The narrative then says that Joseph has sexual intercourse with Asenath, and in time there are 2 kids that are born. And so Asenath then concludes by singing a hymn, praising God, but also praising Joseph, whom she said has reeled her in like a fisherman reeling a fish in on a hook. So that's the story, but notice the imagery, and this really leapt out at us, as it probably has to anybody listening to my summary of this tale. Asneth is a tower lady. She lives in a tower. That's an important detail. Joseph is said to be Son of God. Asneth is said to be the bride of God. Asneth undergoes a 7-day transformation, becoming a new person, almost like, having had 7 demons cast out of her. 7, the number of completeness, meaning a total renewal, a total transformation. She then experiences a heavenly communion with substance from the Garden of Eden. Heavenly Joseph makes a sign of the cross, and Joseph is described as a fisherman. So as we read through this translation, we began to wonder, what is going on here? This is not simply a midrash or a retelling of the story in Genesis. It's not like updating the story for a new and more modern generation. This seems to be a different story, and we began to wonder, we began to suspect that maybe there's something else going on underneath this text, something that would indicate that the text is a superficial tale about other people underneath. So that was our suspicion, and we were getting very happy about that. We hadn't yet decided to write and poke it any further, but then we had an amazing experience. It wasn't just Heavenly Joseph having a communion with Asneth in her bridal chamber. We too had a breakthrough moment. There are very few times in scholarship when we have a eureka moment, and this was it. A time when something completely unexpected turns up that makes all the difference. When we examined this anthology, manuscript 17202, we noticed that there were 2 letters just before the chapter Joseph and Asneth. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had noticed these before. So we asked our translator, could you translate these two letters? And to our astonishment, we found that these 2 letters explained the circumstances under which this writing, Joseph and Asneth, had come to be. That was absolutely amazing. Nobody ever had noticed this. Nobody had translated it. Nobody had talked about it or anything like that. And so, letter number 1. Letter number 1 is from an anonymous individual. We think he might have been a monk because he was literate. And he's writing to a fellow scholar by the name of Moses of Engila, whose Engila is in eastern Turkey, close to Iran today. And this anonymous individual says that he's been rummaging around in the library of the bishops somewhere north of Aleppo, and he's found what he says is a very old book written in Greek called of Asneth. He asks Moses of Engila to translate it from Greek into Syriac, because he's more familiar with Syriac than he is with Greek. Clearly a literate person, but he suspected there was something interesting going on in this writing. So immediately we knew that our manuscript was older than the 6th century. The Syriac, the oldest existing copy of this document that exists, is not just from the 6th century, but it's based on a very old manuscript written in Greek. And perhaps that Greek version might have been a copy of an earlier Greek version, and so on, just like Gospels and many other writings have been preserved. But this anonymous individual then goes on to talk about the importance of obtaining wisdom. Now, our eyes were about to glaze over at that because we don't use the word wisdom. Universities don't teach wisdom, at least in my experience. Churches and synagogues don't deal with wisdom, again, in my experience. Wisdom is a neglected concept as opposed to knowledge and belief. But the ancients, both in Greek as well as in biblical cultures, talked about wisdom quite a bit. There's a whole genre of literature called wisdom literature. There are several books in the Bible like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, sometimes called Kohelet. And in the Apocrypha, there are two major works of wisdom, one called the Wisdom of Solomon, and the other one is called Syriac. And these writings aren't read very much these days, but they were very important in the ancient world. So wisdom means moving beyond the obvious, trying to get insight into the meaning of things, moving more deeply into matters of importance. And after talking about wisdom, this anonymous individual, in letter number 1, does something amazing. He asks Moses of Engila to explain to him its inner meaning, its hidden meaning. And we stood up and took notice. Why? This guy from antiquity thinks that it contains a hidden meaning. There's something more going on in this tale, just as we thought, something more than just, a love affair between an Israelite patriarch and his Egyptian wife. So we came to letter number 2, and that turns out to be Moses of Engila's reply. And so he says, yes, okay, here's the translation from Greek into Syriac. And that translation that he made is what was inserted into this 6th century anthology. So we were working, as we now know, from a translation that he had made sometime in the 6th century on the basis of a much earlier Greek manuscript. But he then goes farther. And again, we have, a lengthy exposition about the importance of wisdom. It's almost like an anthology because he quotes from many biblical and apocryphal writings on the importance of wisdom. And he says to the monk who had written to him, you're going to be very, very careful with this work. I was afraid even to translate it and send it to you. He says, the babbling mouth draws ruin near. In modern context, we might say something like loose lips sink ships, something like that. Beware of what you're saying. And so he urges tremendous caution in dealing with this writing. And then Moses of Engila then goes on to say, yes, the book does contain an inner meaning. Its hidden meaning has to do with Jesus. That was our eureka moment. Two people from antiquity thought, like we were beginning to think, this work contains a hidden meaning. In other words, it's something we have to decode and try and understand what's going on beneath the superficial story. We then had another glass of wine and enjoyed and savored that particular moment. So where do we go from here? Well, I guess our next step was to look at what scholars had said about the text. Bear in mind, they did not have a translation from the oldest surviving manuscript, the Syriac one. They didn't have a digitally restored copy of that manuscript. They didn't know about the two covering letters. So some scholars who had looked at this book on the basis of much later Greek manuscripts said, well, maybe it's from the time of Jesus. Maybe it's from the even earlier times. Maybe the work might even be Jewish. Maybe it has to do with something like intermarriage. How anybody could think that this was a work of Jewish thought absolutely boggled our minds. What were they smoking? This imagery is certainly not Jewish. The terminology Son of God, Bride of God is not Jewish in orientation. A communion service, anybody familiar with the rite of Christian worship, the Eucharist, the Mass, the Holy Communion, would recognize what was going on in that penthouse suite. This is a heavenly communion service. What that would have to do about intermarriage between a Jew and a pagan having to undergo a Christian act of worship absolutely seemed ridiculous to us. So the scholars who had looked at this seemed to us to be very much off track. There was one British scholar, 1918, who thought that the work was Jewish, but then he was Anglican and he knew about the Eucharist and he knew the central act of Christian worship, and he had been neglected all of these years. So, what do we do with all of this? And so our final step was to try and put it all together. So just to review what we had uncovered by means of our detective work. First, we had found out that the ancient writing of Joseph and Asneth was seen by the people who put it in that anthology as a work of wisdom. As Moses of Engila says, it is the glory of God to hide the truth. And wisdom literature is a literature of searching. It means that we, as the readers or hearers of a writing on wisdom, have to be persistent, we have to search, we have to do our due diligence, we have to decipher. And that's the nature of any of those wisdom books like Ecclesiastes or Wisdom of Solomon. And we also knew that the manuscript was found in an important context. These weren't just a random collection of writings, because as we look through manuscript 17202, this anthology, look at the environment in which Joseph and Asneth was discovered. What else did this monk take off the shelf and put into this anthology of important writings? He entitled his anthology, A Volume of Records of Events which have happened in the world, a volume or anthology of events, things that happened in the world. And these were events which helped shape the 6th century world. These were events that were important to a 6th century Christian monastic individual and his audience. First of all, there was a writing by Sylvester, Bishop of Rome, on the conversion of Constantine. Here we have the leading figure within ancient Christianity, the Pope in Rome, Pope Sylvester, writing about perhaps the most significant emperor in Roman history, about his conversion. That act changed the course of world history. We then have another document called The Seven Sleepers of Ephesus. That document's been translated. You can find it on the internet. It's proof of immortality. The story goes that in some particular time, a group of Christians were put into a cave, and a century or two later, they were discovered to be, very well and alive and having a marvelously good time. Proof of immortality. That's very compelling to a 6th century Christian. We then have an important church history by a person called Zacharias Rhetor, and it's a church history that deals with the important councils of the 4th and 5th century. These were councils which tried to determine how do we describe the relationship of the person of Jesus to the Godhead. What is the technical language we need in order to describe the unity of Jesus as part of the Godhead? Again, an important consideration about the development of Christian thought. We then have a writing concerning the discovery of relics that would be venerated, that go back to the 1st century, relics of Stephen, the first Gentile martyr, relics of Nicodemus, who was the Jewish Pharisee who helped bury Jesus. So all of these writings have to do with significant events, or events that this 6th century individual would have considered of tremendous importance. They're all hot topics. But Joseph and Asneth, why would it be included in this anthology of significant, important events that have helped shape the world that this person lived in? How was it an event? Why would a romance between a person who, if he's just an Israelite patriarch, having an Egyptian wife, why would that be of any interest to Christian community in the 6th century? Moreover, we had been given the clue that the 2 covering letters say that this document contains a hidden meaning, and it has to do with Jesus. Now, it's one thing for us to say in our century that Jesus was human and married, but in previous generations, that statement could get us killed, hanged, burned at the stake, drawn and quartered. It happened in history to the Cathars in southern France, northern Spain, who looked at Jesus as a human and less as a divine person. And so we began to suspect that the hidden meaning meant that whatever the author of Joseph and Asenath wanted to say, he had used encoded language. He had taken a savior figure out of the Old Testament and used him as a kind of an avatar or a kind of a surrogate for talking about somebody else. And we're familiar with encoded messages within the Bible. Song of Songs is an encoded message. Rabbi Akiva said that it was understanding the Song of Songs was the key to the scriptures. I'll let viewers ponder that for a minute. But Jesus, in talking about the kingdom of God, used encoded language. He couldn't come right out and say in the audiences that he was meeting around the Galilee with Roman soldiers in the background. He couldn't quite come out and say, look, folks, I'm talking about a better world here, a transformed world. Those Roman soldiers over there, they will be gone. We will have a Jewish king in Jerusalem, and there will be a world at peace, and the world would be massively transformed. If he had said that, rather than talking in parables about the kingdom of God, he wouldn't have lasted the weekend. The Romans would have done him in because they would have understood exactly what he was saying. So encoded language is not something that is foreign to biblical subject matter. Then there's the imagery. Son of God, bride of God. This is more Christian terminology. And it seems to indicate that Joseph is a unique individual. Our text makes it clear that Joseph is a very human individual, but it also preserves his divinity. And that seems to be in accordance with Christian orthodoxy. The creeds of early Christianity talk about Jesus not only as divine, but also as human. And as soon as you admit that Jesus is human, then you begin to admit a number of other questions, like, did he have a sex life? Was he subjected to colds? What were his moods? Did he suffer depression? Did he have hopes and dreams and triumphs, successes, setbacks, and so on? When we begin to look at Jesus as a human being, then a whole range of ideas come into place that are not often dwelt on. One of the earliest Christian heresies, by the way, was a heresy called Docetism. And Docetism is the view that Jesus is solely divine. And in my experience in talking to many Christians throughout North America, places in Europe, many Christians are today heretical. That is, they think of Jesus as solely divine. And if you think of Jesus as solely divine, then you're not going to think of him as human and as having a sex life, as being married, as having a family, of having to get up at 3 a.m. with a wailing kid, of having to deal with, all of the vicissitudes that we're familiar with in bringing up a family. So the imagery is clearly Christian. And finally, there is another matter, which is how did Syriac Christians understand the Old Testament, the Hebrew writings? Now, the Old Testament has always been a problem for Christians because, in a sense, it's irrelevant to Christianity. I mean, the main thrust of the Hebrew writings has to do with the importance of observing Torah, the Jewish lifestyle. and what happens if you do and what happens if you don't. And so in many contexts, one might say, why do you have to have a crash course on Judaism, all 66 of those books, in order to become a Christian, where Christians say you don't have to observe Torah? I mean, the question is pretty blatantly self-evident. Why do you have to go through all that stuff in order to have this stuff? And early Christians answered this kind of question in a number of different ways. In modern terms, we would look at the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, probably historically, try to place David and Abraham, Moses, and so on in their historical context and try to understand these writings that way. Marcion said for Christians, just simply scrap it. The Old Testament is clearly unuseful when it comes to making Christian converts. Just get rid of it. Don't pay any attention to it. Another, perhaps very popular method was used particularly in Alexandria, Egypt. Not only in Egypt, but also in Greece and in Rome. And this was a method called allegory. They allegorized the writings of the Old Testament. Philo did this on the basis of Plato. Remember his allegory of the cave, which talks about how do we understand how we come to true knowledge. Philo did that with respect to many of the writings from the Hebrew Bible. And allegory is a theory of meaning. It's a view that says this writing means really something else. Let me illustrate it. So in the book of Exodus, we have Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt and through the desert. And the travels through the desert go through a number of different stages. I forget how many, it doesn't matter. An allegorist comes along and says, well, we're certainly not going to the Sinai or Saudi Arabia or southern Israel to try and trace all of these routes. Clearly, this is an allegory, and it has to do with the soul's search for God. And would have to do with the various steps as any individual comes to know God and be united with him. So allegory then would de-Judaize the text and basically convert it into a story that would be applicable to all humanity. That was all the rage in Alexandria, and Philo was certainly a leader in that particular movement, and early Christians copied him in many respects. Not so Syriac Christians. They were absolutely opposed to that particular methodology. And there are all sorts of writings. I mean, Syriac and Greek-speaking Christians got into all sorts of fracas in the early church. It's a complicated story. Many of Syriac Christians were expelled as Nestorians and other forms of heretical movements. And the Christians of Eastern Turkey, Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Iran became part of a movement that was outside of Western Christianity. But they employed a method called typology, and it's not something that we're familiar with today, nor is it something we would typically employ, as far as I know. Typology is a theory of history, that one historical event really refers to another historical event. The earlier one is a foreshadowing of the later one. Moses, leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, escapes by passing through the Sea of Reeds, or Red Sea, on into the desert, and then on into the Promised Land. Syriac Christians said, well, don't allegorize that, and certainly don't wander around the Sinai looking for the treks in the wilderness. It is typology, and here's how we understand it. Here's how they would decode it. Moses is Jesus. Jesus is leading humanity, that is, the children of Israel, out of sin, that is, slavery in Egypt, through baptism, that's the Sea of Reeds or Red Sea, on into a period of growth, that's the desert, and then on into the kingdom of God, into the promised land. So the event about Moses really isn't about Moses at all. It's about Jesus. It's about a later event. Syriac Christians were very clear that the Old Testament was not meant for Jews. It was meant for Christians. And that was a point that Paul had made, that Jewish leaders did not understand their own scriptures. And Syriac Christians and their theologians and biblical scholars were all in agreement you could not understand the Old Testament without looking at recent history. So don't ever get allegory and typology confused. That's as bad as confusing a liberal Democrat with a conservative Republican. Fighting words. So, typology. We then started to scour Syriac Christianity, the leaders whose writings have survived, and there are many of them, Ephraim, the Syrian, Aphrahat, and so on. Some of these are found on the internet. If you Google on the internet Joseph as Jesus, you're going to find a sermon. How many sermons survive 1,500 years? Well, one does. And one Syriac sermon has to do with the 50 ways, not to leave your lover, but the 50 ways in which Joseph is a Jesus figure. He finds 50 parallels between Joseph, who's foreshadowing Jesus. And Asneth is mentioned, and she prefigures the tower and Mary Magdalene. So that was our detective story. And there's a lot more in the book, and there's much more along the way, because of the 29 chapters, it begins to talk about not only the marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, which we think this is the inner hidden meaning of this document, but it goes on to talk about the significance of that marriage. And the significance of that marriage has redemptive implications. So that was our detective work in dealing with this ancient manuscript and bringing it to light. And we think that on the basis of this, there is certainly evidence, to put it modestly, that at least some early Christians believed Jesus was married.
Is there anything else that we can know about Mary Magdalene?
Mary Magdalene's an intriguing person because she's always described as Mary the Magdalene. A lot of scholars ignore that because both in Greek and in Aramaic, it is Mary the Magdalene. She's not Mary from Magdala. It's not a place name. She is Mary the Tower. She might have been from Magdala because it had a tower too. It doesn't have to be. Mary the Magdalene is a towering figure of early Christianity. And we know that for a variety of reasons. Just consider Jesus' movement. Who's in the entourage of Jesus? Well, he has family members, 12 disciples. They had wives. Let's say they had 4 or 5 kids each, which is a modest estimate. You're already getting up to a band of 60 or 70 people. There are relatives of all of the disciples. There are relatives of Jesus and so on. You've got a very large entourage. Now, who pays for all that? Well, the Gospel of Mark tells us it was Mary Magdalene. She bankrolled all this, along with 2 other individuals. So Mary the Magdalene was a wealthy individual, a towering lady. We think that she played a very major role in early Christianity, that there was probably a group around her, probably a group that were not as radical as Paul in rejecting Torah, and perhaps not as rigorous as James, Jesus' brother, in observing Torah, but kind of a mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish means of living. And certainly she's referred to in Gnostic Gospels as a consort or companion, a word that has all of the ambiguity that we would have, and an indication that Jesus often talked to her about, the inner meaning of his message. So she's very much of a neglected person, but one thing that we did pursue was if Jesus were married to Mary the Magdalene, are there any artifacts that would describe that? And part of our book looks at mosaics in what are alleged to be synagogues in northern Israel. And these are synagogues that have a mosaic of Helios driving a chariot with a female companion with him and with the 12 figures of the zodiac. And we think that there's more going on in that mosaic, those mosaics. And there are at least 6 or 7 of them in northern Israel. These are not synagogues. And we think this is a form of early Christianity, and that these mosaics belong to early Christian artifacts of a different form of Christianity that did not see redemption on the basis of a human sacrifice on the cross, like Paul did.
And when would you date the Joseph and Asenath text? Do you think that was written perhaps around Paul's time, around the Gospels, or later than that?
That would be speculation.
Hmm.
How much prior to the 6th century was this very early, Greek manuscript of Asenath? We suggest that it might go back to the time of Jesus, because this would provide a context for understanding the abundance of Gnostic literature in the 2nd century. Something had to have preceded the Gnostic literature. And there's elements of Gnosticism within Joseph and Asenath. Clearly, marriage takes on a sacramental quality more than what, mainstream Christianity then or today would do. That marriage is seen as a kind of a sacred union, overcoming the problem that happened, the fault of the universe. Go back to Genesis number 2. Genesis chapter 2 talks about how that original human, male-female composite, is divided into 2. And many people from Orthodox Christianity interpret this as a story of the fall, and that there's kind of a collective guilt through Adam and so on. But other Christians saw this as quite differently. They didn't see it that way. They saw that the earliest problem in the Garden of Eden was the bifurcation of gender, that we have been separated from our other half. However you interpret the other half. And modern gender studies is much more complicated than it was in the early world. So marriage itself had a kind of a redemptive quality within Gnostic Christianity. And we see hints and indications of that within Joseph and Asenath. So we think it could go back to the 1st century on that basis. But that is speculation. Same way that, we speculate how far back the New Testament Gospels go. That too is speculation. Is it 1st century? Or, as some of your listeners undoubtedly know, is it 2nd century?
And I know that and I've had a couple of scholars on too that even question the dating of Paul's letters.
Yes,
Some think they're
because
significantly later.
they showed no impact on their communities until much later on. Whether you date these documents 1st or 2nd century makes very little difference to the conceptual problems that arise. The same problems arise whether it's 1st or 2nd century, which is how reliable are they? How far back do they go to the historic individual that might lie behind Jesus and the historic individual that might lie behind Paul? These are shadowy figures.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Barrie Wilson.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Much appreciated.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.